Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Elena Strong. I'm the Executive Director of the National Museum of Bermuda, and I would like to welcome you to tonight's virtual lecture, Faint and Weary by Working in the Burning Sun, Britain's Convicts in Bermuda, 1824 to 1863, by Dr. Anna Mackay. Joining me tonight is Dr. Anna Mackay, based at University of Liverpool, and my colleague, Dr. Deborah Atwood, curator at the National Museum of Bermuda, who will be moderating the Q&A. Please note that this session is being recorded and it will be available on our website and YouTube channel in the coming weeks. History is far more than a collection of dates, events, and objects. It is about context and builds critical thinking skills and empathy. Learning history is central to understanding contemporary issues and helps explain how Bermuda positions itself in the world, how this was done in the past, in the present, and how it can be done in the future. Tonight's lecture is part of our Bermuda and the Atlantic World lecture series, and one of the many ways the museum is providing opportunities to better understand Bermuda's past. This lecture series intends to explore Bermuda's Atlantic World links and the global forces that have helped shape Bermuda as we know it today. I am so pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Anna Mackay. Dr. Mackay is a historian who researches the lives and experiences of prisoners across the British maritime world. Her PhD, an Arts Humanities Research Council collaborative doctoral project between the University of Leicester and Royal Museums Greenwich, awarded in 2020, explored the topics of prison hulks, a history largely forgotten and a story of empire, prisons, and society as a whole. She's currently a fellow at University of Liverpool, where she is researching 18th century war captives. It's a topic that resonates with the stories we see of present-day wartime displacement and refugees. She's written for the Financial Times, The Guardian, New Statesman, BBC History Magazine, Time Higher Education, and featured on BBC Sounds and History Extra podcasts. And this year, she was a finalist in the BBC and Arts Humanities Research Council's New Generation Thinker Scheme, and she can be heard on BBC Radio 3's Free Thinking program. Before I hand over to Dr. Mackay, I'd like to thank the museum's generous community donors who have made this lecture series possible. They include donors to the Future of History campaign and our Anchor Fund. I'd also like to thank the NMB team who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make all of our programs possible. So thank you again for joining us, and over to you, Dr. Mackay.
Oh, thank you so much for that introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here tonight. I'm going to start by just kind of getting up some questions that we have here. So these are some questions I want us to sort of think about while we're listening to this talk. So where might this kind of history that we're going to be considering today fit in with histories of migration? Think about, how do we find the lives of people who didn't leave a written record? And are there any parallels in the world today that we can connect with histories of prisons and deportation? So 200 years ago, on the 5th of January, 1824, the HMS Antelope set sail from Spithead near Portsmouth in Hampshire, carrying an unusual cargo, convicts. So 300 men, selected for their youth and strength, were sent 3,000 miles from England to Bermuda. So far from home, they were to serve the needs of the empire. They contributed to building works at the Royal Naval Dockyard. And over the next 40 years, convicts lived in cramped conditions on board prison ships. Labouring under the burning sun, they died in their thousands, and many never returned home. So in this lecture, we're going to find out more about the British prisoners who were sent to Bermuda. And in doing so, we'll not only understand some of the nuances about imperial decision-making, so why did the British government decide to send prisoners to Bermuda, and how was the system governed? But we'll also locate the lives and experiences of the convicts themselves. So what was life like for them working in the dockyards? How did they interact with the various free and unfree groups on the island? And what happened to them once they'd served their sentences? So this is a global story, and it's really one that links up with broader histories of migration we're already familiar with. So stories where people were moved across oceans, whether willingly or not. So I want to start out by explaining how I came to Bermuda's convict history. So I researched prisoners in the British Empire. I followed their journeys across the oceans. And the subject of my PhD was prison hulks. So this image here of the Tenedos hulk comes from the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. So this is a great example of what the prison ship actually looked like. So floating prisons like the Tenedos, They were disused and partially dismantled warships or even trading ships that were given new purpose. So you can see in this image here that their masts and rigging were cut down and the ships were often roofed over. So prison hulks in England were first put to use by the British government in 1776 to solve a prison housing crisis brought on by the halt of convict transportation to the American colonies. So we might be familiar with the story of transportation to Australia, but before the sailing of the first fleet of convicts in 1787, Britain actually used to transport its convict population to America, so places like the Chesapeake region, like Maryland and Virginia. But the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War halted this practice, and it caused an overcrowding crisis in British prisons. So the passing of the Hulks Act in 1776 was meant to temporarily alleviate prison overcrowding. So these prison ships then begin to pop up at Royal Naval Dockyards across England. So they're in the Thames estuary, they're in Plymouth, they're in Portsmouth. And men lived and worked, they lived on board, they worked in the dockyards whilst they awaited transportation to Australia, which was a new solution. But hulks were mobile and they were cheap to run. So Hamish Maxwell Stewart has called them mobile labour depots, which I just think is a great description because they could literally be towed from site to site, wherever labour was needed. So what was supposed to be this temporary act actually lasted around 80 years, so up to 1857 in England. And across the 19th century, we see prison hulks begin to be kind of seen to represent all the evils of the British prison system. So they're overcrowded, they're dangerous places. They're not really seen as conducive for reforming inmates too close together. But that didn't stop them from going global. So researching the hulks brought me to Bermuda. So let's start at the beginning. And I want to apologise for covering any sort of well-trodden ground here, but I think for the benefit of some audience members joining us from other locations, I think we should start with a little rundown of geography. So only 20 miles long, Bermuda had been under British rule since the 17th century, and it was in close proximity to Atlantic sea lanes. So Bermuda's location placed it in the eye of all trade, as 9 out of every 10 ships sailing between the Caribbean and Europe or North America pass by. So the Caribbean was a region defined by lucrative markets and exported goods. Bermuda was the opposite. So its key purpose as a British overseas colony was strategic. So the island is roughly 900 miles from the Caribbean, 800 from New York, 870 from Halifax, Nova Scotia. By contrast, a British outpost like Jamaica is a little over 2,000 miles from Halifax, over 1,500 miles from New York. So with losses along the American eastern seaboard after the Revolution and War of 1812, Bermuda's role in supporting British presence overseas became really, really important. So Bermuda was designated an imperial fortress. This strategic position was heavily invested in because Royal Naval squadrons needed safe access to repairs, to refuel, they stocked up on fresh water and food, and they also needed access to military garrisons. So Michael J. Jarvis's work has profiled how Bermuda's intensive maritime community capitalized on its position for trade. However, the significance of convict labor in the history of Bermuda's maritime infrastructure still remains overlooked. It was a central aspect of the development of Bermuda's dockyards across the 19th century. So in 1823, the superintendent of convict hulks in England, John Henry Capper, indicated to the Home Office that the dockyards there in England sometimes suffered from a surplus of convict labour. Capper wrote there wasn't enough work to go around, and he hoped departures of convict ships to New South Wales would thin out numbers and remedy the issue. But that same year in Parliament, the Home Secretary Robert Peel, he began to advocate another type of secondary punishment, which could prove both profitable to the state and solve Capper's problem. So he put forward a proposal for, quote, a combination of hard labour and expatriation to some of the colonies, the Bermudas, for instance, where public works were carrying on. So the development of Island Island in the northwest as Bermuda's primary naval dockyard, that had begun in 1795, with work on the dockyards beginning in earnest in 1809. Now I've circled Island Island here on the left, with the smaller area in St George's to the right, both locations where convicts worked, but the majority of convicts were based in the Royal Naval Dockyard and Bowes Island. So at the turn of the 19th century, labour in Bermuda was provided by various free and unfree workers. So these included contracted men sent out from England, also enslaved labourers, sometimes prisoners of war, even formerly enslaved refugees who'd come over during the War of 1812. But in the years following the Napoleonic and American Wars, combined with some yellow fever epidemics, the island suffered what administrators saw was a labour shortage. So this presented the ideal opportunity to expand the British Empire's convict transportation scheme. It wasn't the first time that convicts had been sent to Bermuda. So during the 17th century, Britain had sold British and Irish convicts into contracts of indenture to be managed by private merchants. But what would follow was on a completely different scale. So the Antelope ship sailed in January, and it arrived in Bermuda on the 8th of February, 1824, just a month after it departed Spithead. So immediately, those first convicts were put to work, and we just want to take a quick look at the numbers in those early years. So this table shows the number of convicts in Bermuda were pretty low in comparison to those on board the hulks in England. It's also way lower than the number of people transported to Australia. So, for example, in 1823, the year before, 651 male convicts had been sent to New South Wales and 750 sent to Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania. So the table does show a marked rise in numbers between 1826 and 7, before rising higher still in later years. Those early years were ones of experimentation. So as the base became more established, more convicts were sent out. But nevertheless, that convict establishment was still expensive to set up. So running the Antelope hulk in Bermuda amounted to just over £7,000. So that's £1,000 more than the cost of running one hulk, the Justicia in Woolwich. But the value of convict labour would only offset costs if the system ran effectively. So basically, the convicts needed to work hard to save the government money. So right from the beginning, in 1824, Superintendent Capper blamed the lack of attention to detail and the costs on the part of colonial officials. When he explained why the cost was so expensive, he insisted the true value of convict labour there had not yet been measured. So the first convicts in Bermuda had been convicted of offences that we wouldn't really consider serious by today's standards. So the most common offences were theft. So, for example, Thomas Adams, aged 22, he was a bricklayer. He stole a woolen greatcoat. That got him a sentence of 7 years. John Lane, 18-year-old baker from Wells in Somerset, he stole clothing as well. He received 7 years. 21-year-old William Finch from Preston, he was a tailor who stole a watch, while Henry Laddick, aged 18 from Devon, stole one duck and a bag, presumably to carry the duck in. But these convicts came from all over the country, so from England, Wales, and Scotland. And once apprehended, they'd be tried in courthouses like the Old Bailey in London, pictured here. So standing in the dock, their sentences would be read out to the crowd to hear before they were bundled off to the hulks or the jail cell to wait transportation. So 1 year after the Antelope arrived, the Commissioner of the Dockyard wrote to the Navy Board in London, stating that further convicts could now be sent out from England. So Captain Briggs suggested, quote, they should be selected from those who served trades specified: masons, house joiners, plumbers, painters, plasterers, horseshoeing smith, farrier, and clockmaker to attend the repairs of the yard clock. So these men with these skills were duly sent out. So we can see they wanted skilled men. Now, once men had received their sentences in the courts, it was only a matter of time until they're transported. You wait a matter of days, weeks, sometimes months. So the scene here on the left depicts a convict ship setting out for Australia. So we see family members waving goodbye to loved ones. But on the right, we have a rare interior photo taken from the convict ship's Success, which later became a floating museum. Now, convicts would have been detained in cells like this during the voyage, and they were let up on deck daily for some air and a bit of exercise. So it was really, really paramount that the convicts sent to Bermuda in those early years were healthy, because the stronger they were, the better they could work. But Bermuda's residents really objected to the arrival of convicts. So they didn't want to become a penal colony like Australia. So no plans were actually put in motion that allowed convicts to ever remain in Bermuda. So their stays were only temporary. Convicts were either transported home or onwards to the Australian colonies. They might also wait for their sentences to expire or for a royal pardon. But even so, a letter printed in the Royal Gazette here in 1830 raised concerns about convicts settling on the island. And it asked, quote, "Are these men to be turned adrift upon us? Is this little colony to be inundated with such a swarm of felons? It's perfectly clear the government in England never contemplated spreading such a pestilence among us." So the author, anonymous, declared that Bermuda's population was too high and the island was continually low on resources, and thus it was unable to provide for any released convicts. Now, Bermuda's population at that time, 1831, say that was about 20,000. And officials routinely argued that there was not enough food on the island to support the local population. Now, Governor Turner commented in April 1827 that, quote, "Except a small quantity of potatoes, there have been cheaply exported, and still a smaller quantity of onions and arrowroot, we have no other means of support from this barren rock." So at that time, Turner was lamenting the shutting of American ports and how it risked driving the colony into poverty and famine. Now, this newspaper article reveals that locals were tapping into this rhetoric to attempt to deter settlement from undesirable groups. But it also shows a bit of a tension between settlers and the metropole back in London who make the decisions. Now, these local objections didn't stop some convicts from hoping they could remain. So one man who'd returned from serving 7 years in Bermuda allegedly reported to his friends that he planned to, quote, "return by the first opportunity to Bermuda as a settler, having found he could employ his industry to better purpose there than this country." So some believe that if the government passed the necessary legislation, many former convicts would gladly return to Bermuda. However, the government listened to, quote, "the strong objections which the inhabitants of the colony are understood to entertain." Only one convict is known to actually have remained in Bermuda, a Mr. Facey, who was allowed to settle in Hamilton, and he ran the mail coaches that linked up the island. So there were no barracks or prisons on Bermuda large enough to house the convicts on the island. So instead, the Antelope ship was converted into a floating prison. So moored close to the dockyard on Island, it held around 230 convicts, and over the next 40-odd years, it was joined by 7 other ships at different times. So many of these ships had previously transported convicts from Britain to the Australian colonies, like New South Wales or Tasmania. Other ships had sailed free settlers to Cape Town in South Africa, so they had quite varied lives at sea. So the image here is of the dromedary, which arrived a little later than the Antelope. And I just love it because it has this fantastic cutaway of the cells, which includes these ladders and corridors, which I think gives a really good sense of the space. So the Antelope served as a hulk until 1845, and others included the Coromandel, the Weymouth, the Tenedos, which we saw earlier, and the Thames. So some were stationed at St. George's at the east end of the island, and hurricanes sometimes pushed the ships up against the breakwaters and caused injuries to the convicts. So once they'd arrived on the island, convicts donned their prison garb of white linen shirts marked with their name, their number, and a broad arrow, plus straw hats to keep out the sun. Their rations were 1 pound 11 ounces of bread, 1 pound and a quarter of meat, and a half gill of rum. At times, this was a greater allowance actually than the soldiers that guarded them. Plus, they had sweetened cocoa for breakfast. Now, they were put to hard labour and left an indelible mark on the landscape. So over time, they worked alongside enslaved people, alongside free local labourers, even British military workers. They completed numerous public works throughout the island, including roadways and breakwaters, Gibbs Hill Lighthouse, the majority of buildings and wharfs still standing in the dockyard today. And when at work in the dockyard, they were guarded by 400-strong detachment of Marines. So what we see here is an image of the dockyard complex. We see casemate barracks, which was built in the 1830s. That's by a combination of enslaved, free, and convict labour. And convicts continued to work on the Commissioner's House, and they also built surrounding dwelling houses for dockyard workers, things like magazines for ordnance stores. And you can see a hulk picture to the left, moored in the same space as you might see a cruise ship today. But those living and working conditions in Bermuda were some of the worst that British convicts could have experienced. So the winter months could be a bit damp and cold, and then stifling during the summer. So dockyards could also be dangerous places to work. So accidents were frequent occurrences. So, for example, in 1829, convict Thomas Lyons died as the group hauled up an anchor from the seabed. So their team of horses suddenly caught fright and moved off, and it tipped the anchor over and crushed Lyons' back and ribs. So his was one of many deaths and injuries. So Edward Griffiths was one of the first men to die. He'd been working as a boatman ferrying convicts from the hulks to the dockyards whilst exposed to the elements. So the ship's surgeon recorded that he was attacked with, quote, shivering, accompanied with pain in the right side of the chest and terrible coughing. Could have been sunstroke, could have been tuberculosis. He was sent to hospital, but he died within 2 months. So William Whiteway, another convict, was working on the ship's sides, probably washing them or painting them, when he was attacked with vertigo and he fell into the sea. Then he suffered from rheumatism afterwards. Lawrence Kenworthy, a carpenter, dislocated his wrist while falling from a scaffold. Others were treated for hernias and abdominal pain after lifting heavy stones in the quarries. So back in London, Superintendent Capper sent word to Robert Peel, the Home Secretary, and he said that some convicts had been, quote, severely attacked with rheumatism and diarrhea arising from the transition of climate. So to Capper, it was the environment that was to blame. And on board the ships, that disease, any kind of disease, could spread like wildfire. So we have outbreaks of dysentery and of yellow fever just raging through those decks. Even, surprisingly, local flora and fauna were potential menaces. So in February 1824, right at the beginning, Christopher Price suffered from an upset stomach and he was admitted to the Antelope's hospital ward. Now, when interviewed, he told the surgeon that he'd been on duty in a dockyard at Ireland, and he'd eaten some prickly pears, although they may not have been what they seemed. So while working in the quarries, reflected glare from the white stone and sunlight made some men temporarily blind. So this reflective glare, what we might now know is prolonged exposure to UV rays, caused ophthalmia, which was an inflammation of the eye that convicts called moon blindness. So they became unable to see. They stumbled over rocks and they couldn't work anymore. So we see descriptions like this appearing in Bermuda's hospital records. So, for example, one Irish convict, Patrick McCarthy, was treated in 1845 for a particularly nasty case of ophthalmia. Brace yourselves. So his left eye was described as experiencing soreness and ulceration of the cornea, which the surgeon commented had latterly become nearly opaque. So the treatment of this was the application of nitrate of silver, quote, applied by means of a hair pencil dipped in calomel, which is an antiseptic traditionally used to treat syphilis. Now, using silver nitrate was a common treatment for burns and ulcerations and infected wounds in the 19th century, but depending on the concentration, it could also be used to cauterize. So opium wine, which is a variant of laudanum, could be administered as a painkiller. And in 1846, convicts petitioned to the Home Office for extra rum rations. They argued that after working in the heat and being blinded, those spirits, more rum, quote, brought the only consolation and comfort when we are both faint and weary by working in the burning sun. In reply, however, it was suggested that 5 additional ounces of cocoa and 4 of sugar should be issued to them, which I think is a bit of a cheat. But ophthalmia was actually so common that convicts returning to the hulks in England were dubbed Bermuda men. They could be told apart. We also see cases appearing in the medical journals of convict ships bound for the Australian colonies, like this one here from the Mount Stuart Elphinstone ship. Now, it's highly likely that convicts travelling on that ship were having problems with their eyesight. It's highly likely they'd already come from Bermuda. So convicts weren't sent just to one place. Punishment was like a chain. So male convicts were often sent first to Bermuda, then to the Australian colonies to obtain their tickets of leave, which were these scraps of paper which were essentially a form of bail, allowing prisoners to start new lives in Australia before the official end of their sentences. Now, Bermuda's Royal Dockyard was far more diverse than the Royal Dockyards we have in England, so I'd like us to just reflect on that. So across this period, 1824 to 1863, convicts worked alongside free and enslaved black Bermudians, as well as white military workers, so Royal Marines, who served in the dockyards as guards, and Royal Engineers, who actually took part in construction projects. So I don't have a contemporary image, I'm sorry about that, but I felt that this one of the mixed society in Australia, it gives us a sense of what people look like in this early colonial period. So the convict is dressed in a yellow uniform. But unlike in New South Wales, Bermuda boasted this unique workforce that challenged racial and class-based division of labour in the colonies. So I mentioned earlier that the idea of transporting convicts to Bermuda had been an experiment, but it was one that was not actually carried over into the other British colonies. So in the Caribbean, for example, the idea of convicts working alongside enslaved people was met with a lot of opposition. So William Berg, the agent for Jamaica and former Attorney General, he stated that the idea of transporting convicts to Jamaica would not only be very mischievous, but would altogether be impractical, as Jamaica's black population was far greater than the black population in Bermuda. So he said the white inhabitants were vastly outnumbered, and that if free and enslaved people witnessed what he called the degraded state of convicts, the balance of society there might become unstable. So this Berg strongly believed that the moral influence, as he called it, of convicts would have a negative effect on enslaved populations, and that islands such as, say, Trinidad, by virtue of their small size, would find it, quote, quite impossible to employ them at a distance from the slave population, end quote. The Bermuda was small too, but it appeared to be less concerns there over racial intermixing, perhaps because the island didn't have a plantation economy. But there are some really interesting case studies related to the Caribbean that I'm only uncovering now. So, for example, people convicted in the colonies could be sent to the hulks in Bermuda. So, as seen in the case of John Waterman, who was a mason from Jamaica, he was convicted there after helping enslaved women escape off the island in 1821. But years later, he turns up in the records of the Antelope. So his sentence in Jamaica is commuted to 14 years. So this is my next big project. So I don't have more examples today. Watch this space is what I'll say, because it's so interesting. So we know that prisoners from across the British Empire could find their way on the hulks to Bermuda. This meant that demographics on board the hulks were far, far more diverse than those in England. So as early as February 1824, Major General Murray, who was the governor of Demerara, now British Guiana, suggested transporting a group of rebel enslaved men who had caused a revolt in that colony to Bermuda. He felt that it was dangerous to return the 15 men to the properties where they were being held in slavery, and he hoped that they might be, quote, removed to Bermuda, a climate congenial to them, and where they might be kept employed as convicts. But the idea that Bermuda could then become this sort of repository for convicts from the Atlantic colonies was not something at all that administrators desired. So by June 1826, pretty quickly, it was requested that, quote, every case of transportation to Bermuda from America and the West Indies must be notified to the Home Department before the convict can be received at Bermuda. So attempts to legislate against this practice really suggest that administrators were keen to racially segregate prisons on the hulks. However, it could more simply reflect concerns over capacity. So could the hulks really accommodate every prisoner convicted in the colonies? And what might happen if they all came together and formed bonds of kinship and solidarity? So in 1830, we even find an instance where two women, Maria Tinney and Sophia Sancius, were transported from Bermuda to Bermuda from Demerara. But authorities agreed this action was a mistake and they immediately sent them back because the hulks in Bermuda only housed men. So many Caribbean and military deserters from Canada and the Caribbean who tried to abscond from service also got sent to Bermuda's hulks from the 1830s onwards. So when we look at the hulk registers, there's lists of names. We see that as early as 1825, Augustine Kennedy was sentenced to life imprisonment for murder in Quebec, and he joined the Antelope, which is pictured here. So when military deserters were housed on the hulks, it actually led to increased security fears. Because, for example, in one incident, the convicts became riotous on board, and the governor of the island blamed intermixing. He said, it is much to be regretted that so large a number of convicts are deserters from the troops, and that the contempt and detestation in the soldiers is so much diminished. So he stated it was impossible to prevent communication between military deserters and any former acquaintances they might have known, And he really pushed to stop the flow of deserters being housed on board the hulks, but he was overruled. So this British officer, Colonel Ferdinand Whittingham, he mentioned in his narrative of the island that ex-military convicts were actually given lighter work on the hulks, so they became guardsmen. But there was no divisions at night, so everyone was locked up together, irrespective of their status. And in the late 1840s, so during the years of the Irish famine, we also see a huge influx of Irish convicts being sent to Bermuda. So the Great Famine caused a unique crisis in Irish prisons. Crimes increased from an annual average of 19,000 between 1842 to 1846 to 31,000 between 1847 and 1850. Now, this resulted in prison overcrowding in Ireland on an unprecedented scale, led to a rapid increase in numbers sentenced to transportation. The introduction of the Vagrancy Act in 1847 that criminalised homelessness, meaning that many people who'd been evicted from their homes became new targets of penal legislation. This is people clamouring outside the gates of a workhouse, this image. But there were also political prisoners, like the Irish nationalist John Mitchell. He was held on board the Dromedary hulk that we saw earlier in a private cabin. Now, one really interesting thing that I found, something that I feel is completely at odds with the way that convicts were generally perceived, is that Irish convicts who were transported to Bermuda in the famine years could actually be viewed as objects of sympathy. So let's take a closer look. So here we have a statement of the number of Irish convicts sentenced to transportation. So you see we have the Medway and the Bangalore mentioned at the base of that table on the left. So in June 1848, the governor of the island, Charles Eliot, wrote to the British Secretary for State for the Colonies with something close to a plea. He said, "It will be remarked with anxiety on examining the lists of the 704 prisoners sent from Ireland in the Medway and the Bangalore, that many of them were convicted for stealing food and agrarian offences in the time of their desperate need." Now, Governor Eliot suggested that he appoint a commission in Bermuda to select certain individuals from these ships who could be recommended for tickets of leave or conditional pardons. He said that, quote, "These prisoners are for the most part friendless men in humble stations of life, that he believes should be considered differently." So of those 704 Irish prisoners who came on the Medway and the Bangalore ships, Eliot was particularly concerned by the presence of 68 boys under 19 years of age. 12 of those were under 16, and one aged 13 had been sentenced to 15 years transportation for sheep stealing. Now, Eliot wrote that poor diet and hardship had, I quote, "for the most part left these lads with a lower stature and more childish appearance than their age alone could explain." So he believed that guidance and instruction, so training in trades such as tailoring, shoemaking, carpentry, would be a better reformatory device for the boys than a spell on the hulks of Bermuda, where they'd be safe from the corrupting influence of grown men on the ships. Now, Eliot ordered for the boys to be kept apart from the rest of the prisoners before sending them on to Van Diemen's Land in Tasmania. But many of these Irish arrivals during the famine were already half-starved before they were transported, so they suffered from scurvy. In fact, their health was so poor that it was recorded that 44 prisoners from a shipment of 704 died in 1848 after arrival. Now, that strikes quite a strong contrast to those healthy prisoners that first arrived on the Antelope, so things are changing. There were many clashes between Irish and English convicts on board the hulks. So in 1859, the Medway hulk was forced to transfer its Irish prisoners to another ship when one man was killed and 24 wounded after a skirmish. Now, Catholic priests were shipped out to provide religious services. Now, they were ferried by boat from hulk to hulk, and it wasn't just religious differences that made men rebel. So in another example, one uprising was described as an open outbreak, as 2/3 of the men on board the Tornados fought back against their overseers. The governor at the time, Governor Reed, described the scenes at night. I quote, "On putting out the lights, there were these groans and hurrahs, knocking out of the lights. The guards are actually afraid of the convicts." In 1847, it was remarked that the officers of the public works had, quote, "not the least authority over the prisoners, other than may be necessary to set them to labour." Now, overseers pressed for greater surveillance on board the hulks at night, but these gradually dilapidated ships, they weren't natural prisons. Now, this picture here shows suggestions for additional lighting on board. So there's little blue dots in the corridors and the separation of prisoners by cells. There were 16 cells on this middle deck, with around 15 men in each of those cells. And that's nothing like the solitary systems being trial back at home. You had your own cell. You couldn't talk to anyone at night. Now, I want to mention another riotous incident that occurred in July 1830, because I think it's a really interesting one that might help us make some connections with the first question we've been considering tonight. So, how does this story fit in with other histories of migration? So, it's what I think is a really noteworthy example where convicts themselves drew parallels between their experience and that of enslaved people. So, in a report to Home Secretary Peel, Superintendent Capper reported one day that the convicts on board the Coromandel hulk had caused some disturbance that year and had lately committed acts of great violence on the persons of the officers placed over them. Now, the Bermuda Gazette here covered the story, claiming that one convict, James Ryan, was mistakenly shot by convicts who were attempting to shoot their overseers. Now, the Gazette reported that convicts on board the Coromandel reportedly sang the rallying cry, "Britons never will be slaves." The chant's a line from the song Rule Britannia, and it highlighted tensions on boards. So convicts were identifying as British, they're clinging to a sense of national identity, but at the same time they're seeing their labour as a form of slavery. So their status as British, potentially their whiteness, connected them to concepts of freedom, especially significant in the wider context of abolition. So the slave trade was abolished in Britain in 1807. It wasn't until 1834 when slavery actually ended. But the enslaved people on the island who worked in primarily maritime and domestic occupations, and afterwards they had virtually no alternative but to continue working for their former enslavers after abolition, often alongside convicts. So by printing details of this incident, the Gazette is strengthening these perceived links between convict labour and slavery. Now, of course, it's completely wrong to equate the experience of convict transportation with that of slavery, but it is still helpful to tap into that 19th century mindset and consider them alongside each other because they were coexisting in the colonies. Now, in fact, in 1820, 4 years before the arrival of the Antelope, the Gazette had published this article. So it's a detailed description of a convict ship as it sailed to New South Wales. So the article's describing the layout of the ships, and it's using this imagery evocative of slave ships and the Middle Passage. So one paragraph on the use of chains stated, quote, "This image of slavery is copied from the irons used in slave ships in Guinea, as in these bolts and locks are also at hand." So as many Bermudian landowners and merchants were also enslavers, these images were maybe less shocking to them as readers than those in England, who had less direct contact with enslaved people. But when we revisit that incident on board the Coromandel, the newspaper articles portraying convicts as a dangerous group, liable to cause harm if they're not properly regulated. But in fact, Superintendent Capper reported to William Tate at Portsmouth later that a small number of convicts returning from Bermuda displayed, quote, "a strong spirit of insubordination and have been refractory in the extreme." There was genuine unease amongst administrators that uprisings would not only destabilise order amongst convicts, but they'd also spread to other workers on the island, whether enslaved or free or even military men. So as I said, these are really, really complex images to unpack, but convicts were nonetheless one other marginalised group that also crossed oceans, also at the mercy of the state. What happened to them was undeniably on a different scale to slavery, a different experience, but it's happening at the same time. And some merchants and administrators are even the same people who are involved. So coercion is this global business that's reaching the far corners of the earth. So aside from any dangers, the intermingling of different groups within the dockyard could also provide an opportunity for convicts to build relationships with locals, including free people of colour who worked in marine occupations, and women who operated as hucksters in the dockyards, selling fruit and vegetables. So there's even an account detailing a romantic involvement between a convict and a local black woman in Colonel Whittingham's narrative account. He wrote that one convict called Lodge made the acquaintance of the wife of a sailmaker, Mrs. Romeo. So the so-called disgraceful romance unveils a historical scandal, and it affords a captivating insight into the complex social dynamics that are woven into the fabric of the island. So Mrs. Romeo decided to leave her husband at the lodge, and upon his release, she fled to England with him, carrying £800 in gold and the title deeds to 3 houses. But unfortunately, the relationship broke up, because when she arrived in England, she found that Lodge hadn't actually yet obtained his freedom. Mrs. Romeo was finally located in a village in Yorkshire, and she was persuaded to return to Bermuda. However, her homecoming was met with challenges, so dockyard authorities initially denied her access to Island, and her husband rejected her. She ultimately found refuge with her mother in Spanish Point. This story highlights broader dynamics of relationships between convicts and people of colour on the island. And no, there are no other known examples of more intimate relationships between locals and convicts. It's clear that they found opportunities to interact. So we see this by examining objects, like these recovered from the dromedary hulk, which can be seen in the Prisons in Paradise exhibition at the National Museum. So these dice, dominoes, cannons, rosary beads, they were personal items that were used by convicts, but they were also made to be traded with locals for extra rations. So they're a really good example of us being able to tell that convicts actually had this interaction with locals. But authorities frowned upon the intermixing of maritime workers and convicts. Now, this was the same at home in England, so anyone who worked in the dockyards might have been persuaded to help prisoners escape. So the prisoners in this image on the right have the word Medway, the name of the prison hulk, sewn onto the front of their clothing, along with their numbers. Their blue armbands may refer to a system of classification that separated them according to behaviour. That could happen. But the dark-skinned man in the boat on the left is dressed differently. He's got a blue shirt on, he's got tailored trousers. So he's likely a pilot or boatman who was employed by the hulk establishment. Now, there's no presence of an overseer in this image. It suggests that maybe on the water, convicts would have actually been able to converse freely on the boats. In fact, Governor Turner stated in 1828 that in their daily journeys to and from the hulks, convicts, quote, have it in their power to board any merchantman and sail away. So some did. They tried to hitch a ride on passing whalers or merchant ships, but they were often brought back home and faced flogging as punishments or reduced rations. But one of the biggest challenges to the convict hulk establishment in Bermuda was actually distance from London as the seat of power. So one stipulation of Superintendent Capper's contract was that he was duty-bound to visit the prison hulks under his command 4 times a year. So in the House of Commons, complaints had already been raised that hulk superintendents were unable to, quote, see or hear what was happening at each station from their residences in London. So the distance between Capper's home at Lambeth Terrace and Woolwich was around 10 miles. Conversely, Bermuda was around 3,500. So official dispatches between Bermuda and offices back in London could actually seldom be expected to arrive in less than a month. The reply to an urgent query could therefore not be available for 2 months because he went back and then forth. So Capper actually had to describe the situation in Bermuda to the Home Secretary by relying on reports sent from the Commissioner of the Dockyard, the Governor of the island, as well as anything from officers that might come through. So in one report to the Home Office, Capper stated, "I have every reason to believe that the overseers are attentive to their duty." There was little way of actually knowing whether the reports were accurate. And to counter this, he ended up employing an assistant superintendent as his man on the ground in Bermuda. So this was Commissioner Thomas Briggs, who freely communicated with Capper from 1828 onwards. But within a decade, the governance and control of the convicts changed again. So in January 1837, the governor of the island was actually given sole responsibility of the station. This meant that officials could act quickly when riots or disturbances took place. And the change in governance wasn't necessarily a guarantee of better practice. Governor Reed reported that he found construction works to be, quote, in a far less finished state than expected. He wrote to the Colonial Office that works in the dockyard that was supposed to be completed by 1832 were still ongoing in 1839, and he expected them to last for a further 15 years. So this is an image of one of the last hulks taken in Grassy Bay. In fact, it's one of the only photos we have of a prison hulk at all, so I love it, especially because it's in Bermuda. So critics of the system could argue that away from the surveillance of authority, standards slipped. But by June 1847, Bermuda's Governor Stuart stated in a letter to Earl Grey that, quote, no time should be lost in constructing barracks and buildings for the whole establishment on Bowes Island, in addition to Island Island, and that no more hulks should be retained here than may be necessary. So permanent structures of prisons, they were gradually replacing the shoddy accommodation afforded by the hulks, which were finally disbanded in 1863, along with the convict system in Bermuda as a whole. But if we're talking about endings, we need to know what happened to the convicts, not just the hulks. So remaining prisoners were sent home when work was deemed complete, or they went on to continue their sentences in the Australian colonies. So those who left the island could do so in changed circumstances. They earned small sums of money as labourers, and they could even be taught to read and write. But of those 9,000 convicts sent to Bermuda between 1824 and 1863, close to 2,000 died. So in Sands Parish, across the road from the ornate gravestones, the Naval Cemetery is a quiet graveyard. Here, only 9 gravestones represent approximately those thousands of convicts who are believed to have died on the island during their incarceration. Colonel Whittingham called it a bleak, unshaded piece of ground. The graves looked like garden beds laid out in barren soil, doomed neither to blossom nor to bloom. A short distance down the road on Watford Island, there's a second graveyard with unmarked graves. So these were people who lived and died so that Britain could project an image of strength to the world. They never saw their families again. They never returned home. So on that note, I want to leave you with a few areas of recommended reading and online resources that might help you if you're interested in finding out more or even tracing a criminal ancestor. So the UK National Archives has some excellent online resources related to convict transportation. The Digital Panopticon website, that's a fantastic resource that allows you to trace convict lives across Britain and Australia. You can also search specific names of people convicted at the Old Bailey courthouse in London too, and you can begin to trace their journeys. There's also records Find My Past related to hulks, some things on Ancestry.com, like the medical journals that we looked at. Now, often local libraries, I will say, have subscriptions to these sites, so really do check them out first before you sign up to a free trial. And you can even find convict transportation ship records and the names of individual ships and even their passengers online, thanks to researchers in Australia. So don't forget, there's also some great heritage sites. Connected to convict transportation, you can visit today. So obviously, the National Museum of Bermuda. There's also Spike Island in Ireland, Cork. Even the HMS Victory in Portsmouth, England, gives you a great sense of what shipboard life was like. So thank you everyone for listening, and thanks again for the National Museum to inviting me to talk. And those of you who are based in Bermuda or have connections to Bermuda, I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts and comments, and I'll do my best to answer questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Anna. That was a fascinating presentation, and there was a lot of moments where it was generating more questions for me, especially those connections with the Caribbean and the movement of convicts, not just from the UK to Bermuda, but elsewhere to Bermuda, and this transitioning and this wider network of convict hulks and transportation. I'm sure many of you have questions. We have time for about 3 questions. Please put your questions into the chat now, and we'll select a few for Dr. Mackay to answer.
There's a lot to take in. That was a packed one.
It's a lot. You've shared an immense amount of information there. I guess I'll get started with one question. What did the wider Victorian society make of the hulks?
Ooh. It's a really interesting thing because we looked at some of the Bermuda Gazette things, which I'll say are digitized online, so please do check them out at the library. But yeah, wider society, it was really interesting because at the beginning, like sort of in the 1700s, so turn of the 18th century, all the newspaper reports are reporting stuff like convicts are dirty, they're dangerous, and they will morally corrupt you if they escape. So there's this big fear of like the convict in society, and it's sort of morally corrupting you, making you basically turn into a convict yourself. But over the course of that 80-year period in England, we see it again in Bermuda, but less because there's less newspaper coverage. But people begin to change their view of convicts, and they start to pity them. And so we mentioned the Irish famine convicts are being seen as these objects of sympathy. It's almost like the state is being criticized more than the convicts themselves as the system goes on. And it's because the prison system's changing over time. So we're moving away from stuff like, whipping and chain gangs right at the beginning of, say, the 18th century to the 19th century, to these big ideas of what a prison should be and reform. So there's this sense of these people being caught up in processes. And I just think it's very interesting. They go from being afraid of convicts to being like the objects of sympathy and pity.
And I think that definitely comes through when you share some of the human stories and even some of the ages of the young men and women that were transported. It is quite astonishing when you reflect on it in terms of modern society and things like that.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's interesting that the convict story in Bermuda is like, it's a male story, but there's obviously women in Bermuda. There's women who are affected by transportation still as well. So there's wives and children who get left behind. Often women are the people who are petitioning to get their husband's freedom. So you get a wife in London replying to the Home Secretary saying, my husband's in Bermuda, he's been good, he's been working hard, he helped the administrators there, could he please be considered for a pardon because my family is destitute. So you see this back and forth that where you can weave women into the story and anyone is connected to them.
So I guess I did have another question pop up. In terms of, we saw it on that wonderful image that you showed where the families are saying goodbye on the shore. Was that, is there evidence of letters being sent back home? Is there any sort of financial contribution that can be sent back home? Or is it literally once your family member is sent, that's it? There's no contact?
Quite a bit. Which is, yeah,
okay.
You get lots of letters from women saying, my husband's been transported, we're destitute, my family. You do get instances, one convict I've been tracing recently who escaped from the hulks in Chatham. His wife then got transported to Australia because she was destitute. So she had no choice but to, steal something from her employer. So they both end up being sent to Australia at different times. They never see each other again. He dies on Norfolk Island in the middle of the Pacific, and she dies in Sydney. And it's just this terrible story of people being affected by the prison system. But you have these things called love tokens. They have lots of them in Australia. So when a convict was being transported, he would take a penny and he would stipple it. So really sort of like, hammer a small image into it that says something like, like a family motto, or, just a sort of, leave it behind and send it to your wife as a memento. So the National Museum in Australia has an amazing collection of convict love tokens. You do also see letters in Bermuda as well of people writing back to their family. They say stuff like, it's horrible here, it's so hot, we can't bear it. And people, sometimes they even get in newspapers. So you have newspaper articles from people saying Bermuda is terrible, it's this den of sin. And it's just another layer of sort of opposition to convicts being in Bermuda at all.
I had another question that's come up about the images. So you shared some, as I kind of already said, some really fantastic images. Are there many images of convicts about, or are they quite limited in archives? I think the ones that you shared towards the end of the convicts in Bermuda are in New South Wales Museum, is that correct?
Yes, they are, and I don't know where they came from. So you might have seen, so like we said, there's some amazing watercolors of prisoners in Bermuda. There's only they were done in the 1860s. People aren't sure when, so it's towards the end of the hulks in Bermuda. Don't know who did them. The State Library of New South Wales owns them, and they're out of copyright, so they're free to use, which I love. But yeah, it's very strange. Like you have there's a great article in the Illustrated London News in, I think, the 1840s that sort of describes the convict station in Bermuda. And it's weird because they're almost sort of don't want to say orientalizing it, you know, they're kind of like, look at this weird paradise island, and they kind of describe how beautiful Bermuda is, but then it juxtaposed against these images of convicts, and it's almost like they're trying to say that it's not so bad being a convict if you get sent somewhere like Bermuda. But as you see in all the letters and petitions, people and the medical records particularly, convicts are not having a good time there.
Yeah, so we actually had a question from Tim Rogers, which I think kind of is a nice add-on to how you answered that. Was he says, with the Boer prisoners, there were sympathizers who gave prisoners food, stamps for mail, etc. Is there any evidence of that in Bermuda for the convicts?
Oh, well, I mean, we mentioned like hucksters and people who, you know, sold fruit and vegetables. You're not supposed to be doing that. So there were certainly people who, you know, it was almost like a, you know, a good little hustle to have to be able to sell things to convicts. And so that's why I love those the objects and the material culture that the museum has, because there's just these amazing things that show us that convicts were making things to be traded. But what I love about those objects is that, for me, it feels like a lot of them are personal. So they're like things like dice and rosaries and rings. They're things that convicts would wear. They're things that, you know, they would pray with. They're things that they would play with, like gamble. And that shows that a lot of the objects that were sort of being filched from, you know, bits of limestone from the quarries and things like that were being used for, yeah, personal use, but as well as being traded. So yeah, there are definitely opportunities for people to come together. So I've just been working on an article about that, and I just love that there seems to be more of a reluctance for convicts to sort of mingle with military workers. So they're more opposed to them working with white workers than they are with people of colour. And I think that's really interesting that they see that's almost like less of a threat, or a threat, you know, depending on your social status, your class, or your race. There's all these different things happening in Bermuda than we see in, say, the dockyards in England.
Yeah, it's definitely a more nuanced, I guess, investigation into the situation, not just in Bermuda, but wider as well. And it sounds like you're doing that for sure. From Hillary, we have the question, what proportion of prisoners went on to complete their sentences elsewhere?
Oh, quite a lot. I mean, I don't have the numbers, but it was a considerable amount. So I mentioned this thing called like secondary punishment at the beginning, and I should have really clarified that secondary punishment was just like primary punishment, it's being like hanged, you know. So secondary is this kind of like new way that prisons were trying to sort of deal with their criminal population. So that means you're being transported. So that transportation system really changes over time. So you have kind of starting in the 1780s, people get sent to Australia. But then over the period of the 19th century, at the same time as Bermuda, they're trying to work out what's the best way to punish prisoners. And so they send them to, you know, the hulks in England. You might be there a couple of months, a couple of weeks even. Then you get sent to Bermuda. That's one of the stages of punishment. Then you get sent to, you know, Tasmania, or you get sent to Australia, you know, like New South Wales, and then you get sent back to England, and then you finish your sentence there. So everyone is hopping around in all these different locations. So some of them completed their sentences in Bermuda. You know, you would have just been like served your 7 years there. Some of them, you know, who were doing 14 years then went on to Australia. So it was really sort of like you could be on Bermuda for years, you could be there for months. It really depended on, you know, what your sentence was and whether you were a good worker, or literally just whether a convict ship was sailing to Australia and they needed to make up numbers.
Wow, interesting. We have another question, I think more to do with more genealogy and ancestry. The question is, how can we find out who worked on the ships and what they did? Our great-great-grandfather worked on them and met our great-great-grandmother and married in Bermuda 1865.
Ooh. Well, if the hulks were disbanded in 1863, you may still be able to find them in this sort of early register. So my first thing would be check out Find My Past. They have the registers of prison hulks. So you can search for the names of your ancestors, and you can even include a little tick box that says, like, you know, disambiguation. So you can have, like, you know, it might be spelled differently in the registers. So they definitely have prison hulk registers relating to Bermuda. So hopefully you can find your ancestor there. If not, maybe, I mean, one of the best ways to find someone is if they were ill. So Ancestry has ship's surgeon's logs for certain convict hulks, some of which were in Bermuda. So we did say the Antelope's one today. So depending on what ship they were on, that kind of thing, you may well be able to find them.
Okay. So I'm mindful of the time and that it's 6:30 now. I just want to say a final thank you to Dr. Mackay for presenting today and answering the questions. If you do have any further questions that perhaps didn't get answered, please feel free to send them via email to curator@nmb.bm, and we will forward them on to Dr. Mackay for hopefully answering, if not
Absolutely
more research questions. So I also want to give a big thank you to the NMB team who are working hard behind the scenes, and to all of you for joining us tonight. It's been a real pleasure, Anna, and good luck with the rest of your research. To dive deeper into the lecture topic, we do have a syllabus available on our website, and next week we will be sending the lecture recording and a short survey so we can continue to improve our work. So if you did register for the lecture, watch your emails. We'll be sending that out next week. Everyone, thank you for joining us and have a good evening.